everyone, and welcome to this bonus tutorial. In this one we're going to draw this lovely rose in graphite. Now before we get started, I just wanted to touch on a few things in regards to materials, etc. With the way the world is at the moment and cost of living and prices of everything just seems to be soaring. It's such a shame that our creative sort of endeavors, are one of the first things to go. It doesn't have to be that way. The benefits of being creative and taking time out for yourself, and drawing and sketching and painting and all of those different things, I think the benefits of doing that far outweighs sometimes the cost involved. But I wanted to just briefly show you that it doesn't have to. You don't need hundreds of supplies. You don't need, expensive materials. It's things that you've probably got sitting around your house, as we speak. So I want to just touch on, first of all, paper. Now, paper is probably, in any medium, one of the most important things I think you need to spend your money on. But again, there is so much choice out there in paper, and especially for things like graphite. The only thing I would recommend, and I like to use, again, this is just my choice, I use the Strathmore Bristol smooth paper, and it's 270 GSM. That's basically the weight of the paper. It's like a normal printer paper, for example, is around about 80 GSM, which means it's really smooth. Anybody that's used a printer will know what printer paper feels like. The bigger that GSM goes, the thicker that paper is, and the more what we call tooth is in the paper. So it holds more pigment. It doesn't just slide and smear off the page. Now that one, like I said, was 270, but the real sweet spot you probably want to look for is maybe between that 150 and 200 mark, if you can pick something up round about that. Something that's just got enough weight to it that it's going to hold those layers of pigment that you're going to be putting down. Now the next thing is pencils. Now, again, graphite pencils, you can get various sizes of sets. I'll grab just this one here. This is just one that I purchased recently, was the graphite matte set, which doesn't give you as much shine. You get cheap sets. There's loads and loads and loads. Now I use the Derwent Graphic, and this probably is a slightly more expensive brand. But I'm doing obviously a lot of tutorials, etc. I had a bit of a look. I used to have a Faber-Castell set, and I think at today's prices it's around about 12 Australian dollars for, I think it's a set of 8 pencils, which for the US is about $8, and the UK probably about £6. And those pencils will last you for ages and ages. So have a look at what you can see. Pencils, like I said, a graphite pencil is a graphite pencil. So just buy what you can afford. If you can't afford a full set, get a couple. I would always recommend getting probably an HB, which is sort of smack bang in the middle. To explain just quickly how these sort of letters work. If you have a hard a H pencil, I'm just going to see if I can find one. So for example, this is a 7H, which means that it is really hard. So the higher that number goes up, the harder that pencil is, and the lighter and the finer that graphite's going to be. Now when you get into the B's, it starts to get softer. So for example, here's a 7B. So the 7B, if I can hold the two of those pencils together for you, just to show you, you can see just the difference in the thickness of the lead, but also the softness of that lead. So when you put that 7B down, it's going to be softer, it's going to be darker, as where this one is going to be harder and it's going to be lighter. So getting back to the HB is basically smack bang in the middle. So that's a great one to have. Then I would probably suggest, if you were just going to invest in a couple of pencils, would maybe to get something round about a 6B. You know, a 4 or a 6B, something that'll just give you that darker pigment. So that's basically pencils in a nutshell. Now you'll see a lot, and I do it as well, I like, for backgrounds and putting down a base layer, I like to use graphite powder. Now, you can buy graphite powder in tubs. Don't waste your money. Get a graphite pencil, and I always just use, and I'm still using it, just an old one from my son's days at school. And this one is it just happens to be an 8B, so I use that one. And all you do, let me just cover this up so I don't make a mess. All I do is just grab a bit of sandpaper, and this is just a sheet from my husband's garage. I think it's about a 120 grit or something. And all I do is just sand back a bit of that pencil. And you can see that it just sort of starts to accumulate some of that graphite. And that is your graphite powder. All I would then do then, and I'll mention this a little bit more when I speak about blenders, etc., is just use whatever blender you're wanting to use, dab it into that. I like to have a wee bit of printer paper just so that I can just test how dark it is before I put it onto my drawing. But that's it. A wee bit of sandpaper and a piece of printer paper and a pencil. That gives you your graphite powder. So don't go wasting your money sort of, you know, paying for something that someone else has already done for you. It's the same as when you go to the supermarket and you buy pre-cut carrots. You know, they're going to be a lot more expensive than if you just buy the carrot and cut it yourself at home. So that's basically graphite powder. Don't waste your money on the pre-prepared stuff. Now, erasers. Now again, I have a selection that I use in my tutorials. So for example, I have a battery operated one, which is great for getting those really bright sort of highlights. I have this little sort of pencil style one, which is great because you've got that really nice control like you would with a pencil. And then probably my favorite is the Tombow mono eraser. And that's great. You just sort of press it at the bottom like, you know, a mechanical pencil. The eraser sort of comes out. You can cut it to a nice fine edge. So they're great. Do you need them? No, you don't. Get yourself just a normal, a normal eraser. Yeah, any office supply store would have one. You can manipulate it. You can cut little edges into it. You can cut little bits off of it so that you can create a bit of a point so that you can get those really fine details in. So don't think you've got to rush out and buy all these erasers. A normal, you know, just $2, $1 even. I think that would probably go, if that. And that's going to last you for ages and ages. Now, on this sort of drawing here, you'll see that I've sort of taped my paper down before I put my line art down. And the reason I always leave a wee bit on the edge, I haven't done it here because I'm not doing a background. But if I was doing a background, I'd always tape all the way around. Now, the reason I do that is A, you can hold the paper without touching your drawing. And B, when you come, if you wanted to come and frame that and you wanted to put a little bit of a mount on there, you've got that space and you're not encroaching into your actual drawing. Now, in regards to tape, any sort of painter's masking tape that you get from the hardware store, I've got just a white sort of one there, but you can use sticky tape. Now, try and get something that's low tack. That's why I like to use these, because you don't want to damage your paper. But if you don't want to use sticky tape, just what I sometimes do is I'll sort of just tear the strip of this off, but I'll run it over, you know, my shirt or my pant leg or something like that, just to sort of take the stickiness off of it a little bit, just to make it a little bit less tacky, or sorry, yes, less tacky. And then just use normal sticky tape, and you know, we can get that anywhere. So that's sort of in regards to tape. If you didn't want to use that, of course, you could just get yourself a magnetic board that you get from sort of hardware and office supply stores and things like that, and then just get yourself some magnets. You know, you can just get little magnets like I've got there. I've got the little flat ones there, or you get these little ones, and then you can just put a little magnet in the corner if you wanted to. So that's just another idea there. Now with erasers, I did want to mention, which I forgot, I'll just take a wee step back, is the kneadable erasers. And you can buy these. This is the Faber-Castell one. And these are fantastic. These are great for just adding details, for picking up little bits of dust and so forth. But you know what else you can use? A little bit of blue tack. You don't need to buy a specific kneadable eraser if, I mean, these aren't expensive, but if you've got a bit of blue tack lying at home, it does more or less the same job. Just be careful that there isn't, you know, too many dyes or anything in the brand of blue tack that might sort of go back onto your paper. So just give it a wee test maybe beforehand. But basically, that's all these things are. It's just very similar to blue tack. But like I said, these aren't overly expensive to purchase, and they last for ages. All you do is you manipulate them and get a clean spot, and then just use that. And sometimes you can break a little bit off and just use a tiny little bit in that specific drawing, and you can manipulate it into any sort of shape and that you want. So these are fantastic. Now blenders, that's another one I wanted to quickly touch on. Blenders, you can use anything in your imagination. I use a lot cotton wool ball for doing backgrounds, cheap makeup applicators that you can buy in bulk, which works out really, really cheap per item, and these last forever. But one of the greatest ones I use across probably all of my mediums is a Q-tip. Q-tips are fantastic. You know, almost every single one of us is going to have some Q-tips or cotton buds lying around. And again, you can buy these in bulk if you wanted to, and they'll last you for ages and ages. You know, like I said, think outside the square. You could use tissue, a little bit of, you know, tissue paper, a little bit of kitchen roll. All those different sort of things you can use as a blender. You can purchase things like color shapers, which are just like little silicone tipped little blenders. But again, I mean, they're reasonably cheap. You can get a pack of 5, just different sort of shapes. But again, it's not necessary. The Q-tip will do exactly the same job as one of those. All right. What's next? Sharpening. Just briefly touch on that. My preferred way of sharpening all my pencils, whether that be graphite, charcoal or pastel, is a craft knife. And I've just got one of these ones that I got from the hardware. They've got the blades that you can sort of switch over. So you basically are getting 4 sort of edges that you can use off that blade. Another one you can get are these sort of style where you just sort of push up the blade and you can snap off the blades as you go. And then I just use those and then get some sandpaper. So again, similar, just a bit of sandpaper like I was using to do that graphite powder. Or you can get these little things here that have got the sandpaper on it. But again, why would you, I mean, I've just got one of these because I got it in a set of something else I bought. But why would you bother buying that when you can just get a big sheet of sandpaper and just cut little bits out of it? So that's how I like to sharpen. But again, you don't need to go out and buy a craft knife if you're not comfortable. Just get yourself, for graphite, just a normal sharpener. Yeah, I think these were $1. I think when I bought mine. And again, last you ages, and you get even smaller ones than that, the little plastic sort of ones. So that's really all you need in regards to sharpening. You don't need to use a craft knife if you're not comfortable with that. The last thing that I would recommend that people get is just a soft bristled brush. And the reason I like these is that when I do sort of come in and do any sort of lifting with my erasers, you get those little crumbles, little crumbly bits. And it's nice just to be able to just sort of flick those off. You don't want to be touching your paper. The thing with graphite is, try and think of forensics and things like that, that the reason that they use like that graphite sort of based stuff for taking people's fingerprints is that the oils in our hands really sort of don't work well together with graphite. So I wouldn't want to be coming in and touching the paper with my fingers. That's why I always go for my brush and just give it a little brush like that. So that's basically it. I might sort of mention some other things as I go through. But like I said, don't think that just because I'm using a certain material that that's what you've got to use. Think out of the box. You don't have to rush out and buy all of these things that I'm using to blend. Speaking of blending, probably one other thing that is good when it comes to blending, when I was mentioning Q-tips, etc., is these things. They're called like paper stumps. And they're basically just really tightly rolled, compressed pieces of paper. So again, these are reasonably cheap to buy, not a necessity. You can use your cotton buds or your Q-tips. But these come in all different sort of thicknesses and sizes, different brands. Yeah, that one's probably just a little bit sort of thicker than again. So, you know, you get these different sort of ones, and these are great, you know, as blenders for your graphite. But again, you don't need to rush out and buy those. If you've got cotton buds at home, use cotton buds. All right, so I think that's enough about materials. What I wanted to do is just touch on putting your line art down. Now, I do like using this transfer paper from Sarl. It's really good. This is that you get all different colours in it. This one's the graphite colour. And I also have the white, which I use in my pastel drawings a lot. If I'm going for a lighter subject that I don't want the darker line art down. So basically it looks just like that, like the old sort of copy paper we used to put in when we were using typewriters, I suppose. And I just lay that down. So I'll position my sort of image down on the paper, and then I'll just slide that, making sure you get the right side, down underneath that paper in between your line art and your paper, and you just transfer over the top. But again, you don't have to rush out and buy that. You don't need it. All you need is a graphite pencil. So let me just show you on this one how we're going to do that. So print off your line art and flip it over so that you've got the back of the paper there. I'm just going to, so I don't damage my paper too much, I might just see if I can put something over the top here. Hold that there. Now all you want to be doing is taking, and this is just that same 8B pencil that I used to create my graphite powder. You just want to come and just go over where the lines are, you know, where your drawing is. Don't need to press too hard. I just like to just come in and across, making sure that you're covering all of the area. Again, down here with a little stem. And just come over the top. Like so. And then what I like to do is I like to just come in and go over the other direction, just so that I haven't missed anything. So I just give it another little swipe over. Now, if you were doing a much larger line art, so a much larger drawing, then you might consider going down the road of getting yourself some of that transfer paper. But when I first started out, this was my go-to method on all of my line arts. And a lot of people, especially not so much with graphite drawings, because obviously it's graphite, but a lot of people just sort of go no when it comes to maybe pastel drawings using this method. As long as you're not digging, when you're doing your transfer and your line art, that you're not pushing really hard on it. I've never found an issue. I've never really had a problem with my line art sort of showing through. I've always managed to cover it. But obviously with a graphite drawing like we're doing today, this, is, a moot point because it's graphite already. That's all you need to do. That's it. That is your background popped in there. All we need to then do is flip it back over. Let me just move this piece of paper. It was just protecting my drawing paper there. Then all we need to do, let me just grab my little bit of tape just to secure it. I just use a little bit of the masking tape, and you just want to position it where you want it on your paper. I probably want a little bit more, like the reference, a little bit more over to this side. So maybe about there perhaps might do it. And then you just get that piece of masking tape and you want to secure it right across that corner. And on a bigger piece of paper, you'd maybe even come and consider doing something down here. What you want to do is you want to be able to have one side free that you can lift up and have a look and see if your line art's going down properly, but you don't want it to move. So securing it down there will stop that movement. And then all I do then is just grab a pen. I've just got one of these ones that's got the multi-colours, and I like to use a different colour so that I can see where I've gone. So I wouldn't use black, for example, here. So I would just use maybe the red. And then all we do is transfer our line art. So we just come over those lines. You don't need to, like I said, don't dig hard. Don't be pressing really hard. Pull that back, have a wee look. See, that's perfect. And that was hardly any pressure. You start digging in, you're going to indent that paper. So you just want to be careful. And again, just coming around the whole of the rows. Now, I'm not going to film me doing this because, I think it's quite, self-explanatory on what you need to do. So you're just going across all of the detail in the line art, just every now and again, just lifting up that piece of paper just to make sure that it's still showing. If you feel that there's a little area that you haven't got enough pressure on, you can go back over it again. Now I'll show you when we start our drawing what I like to do in regards to if I feel that my line art's too dark. But we'll get onto that once we've got our line arts down. Right. So magically the line art is now down. And if we just lift that up, you can see that we've got that beautiful transfer to start doing our actual drawing. So I just remove very gently, just lift that off. That's done. Now, and especially if you were using transfer paper, you've got to be careful when you're leaning on the transfer paper because you can end up depositing some of it down. And if you've gone over the top of the back of your line art, bigger than I did, sometimes when you lean, the same thing can happen. So if you do get any in your look, this isn't a big thing if you're not doing a background. If you are doing a background. If you're not doing a background, you want to keep your paper nice and clean, then all you need to do is come in with either, your eraser, whatever that eraser may be, and you just come in and you can just dab, clean it up a little bit. Just look for any little spots because the last thing you want to do is be leaving them on there and then potentially leaning over the top of them, which is going to push them into that paper and make it a lot harder for you to remove. Now, I was discussing the sort of the depth of the line art. I always like to do mine a little bit darker because I'm filming and I've got bright lights in my studio. So therefore I want to make sure that you guys can see what I'm doing. If it's just you, then, and you feel that you've come in a little bit too sort of dark, what you can do, and this does come into play when you're doing a lighter subject. So during the course of the drawing, we probably will lift some of these lines because they're too dark, I think, anyway. But I'll do that as part of the process. But if it was just yourself, you can just, again, come in with one of your erasers and you just tap. If you tap along the line, it lifts it. You can see how much lighter that line there got, for example. That probably wasn't the best one to do because that is quite dark, that side. I would have been better doing it over here. But you get the gist. You just sort of tap. You can tap along that line. Don't be rubbing it out. Just give it a wee tap and you can see the difference on how much lighter that is. And for you and me also, looking at it here, that is more than enough for me to see those lines. Like I said, don't think you've got to go as dark as I did because, you know, I'm doing that for filming purposes. All right, let's get stuck in. So, to sort of protecting your paper, I like to use glassine paper. Now you can buy these in sheets, in rolls. You get them if you do any sort of pastel drawings. You can get these in between the sheets of pastel matte paper. If you can't source glassine paper, it's a bit like a really thin, it's like parchment paper really, but thinner. And it is good. But if you can't get a hold of that or you don't want to, just put just either a normal piece of just printer paper. You could just sort of sit that and rest your hand on that, or you've got just something like some kitchen roll, something like that would work. Or you can get little gloves and they sort of fit over those two fingers and sort of come round your hand so that when you're resting like that, the little glove is sort of sitting on there. But any of those, just like I said, plain piece of printer paper, and you're just, that way you're not sort of smudging anything. If you're, you know, any oils on your hands aren't getting on your paper. So that's what I like to do, just to sort of rest my hand on. So we're going to come in, I'm going to try and do this one reasonably quickly. We don't want to sort of spend too much time on it. So I want to get a layer of graphite powder down. I often find using graphite powder gets that base layer down quicker. Like I said, use your pencils to create your graphite powder. Now I'm going to use just one of these makeup applicators to apply mine. Like I said, you could use a cotton bud or something like that. So grind back your graphite powder and just dab it on that piece of printer paper that I mentioned to use, just so that you can see how dark it is. You would not want to be coming in unless it was a really dark background, for example, or a dark area. You certainly wouldn't want to be coming straight from that powder onto your drawing. So I always just like to just dab it onto that printer paper so that I can see sort of what sort of depth of colour it is, or tone. So it's quite a bright rose when you think about it. But it is darker than the background. So I think I've got probably enough that I want on my applicator. And we just want to come in, and I always like to go for my darker areas first. So if I can see that there's a dark area, I'll do those first because it's using up what's on my applicator so that then I can do the lighter sections. Now remember, I did say that as we work through this, I probably will lighten up some of these areas because this area here is quite bright and light. So I'm just going to come in with my Tombow eraser, and I just sort of come over the edge and just sort of lift that off. Now you can use your kneadable eraser as well. So whatever eraser you're using. And then I'd just like to come in and just lift that a little bit more. And remember, we want to get rid of those crumbles. So that's where your little brush comes in. And then I'll come back in with that applicator. And we just sort of build up in here. We can see it's a little bit darker in that sort of shadowed area. Again, it doesn't matter if you sort of go over and make something, you know, either too light or too dark, because we can fix that up. All we're doing here is just trying to get, you know, those sort of blocks of, you know, I'm probably going to keep saying colour because that's just, I'm used to saying that. But we just want those blocks of tones. That's what we want to be saying. Again, we just sort of have a bit of a look and just see if something, just one of those lines just needs to be lightened a little bit. Because we don't want we want this rose to be lovely and soft. You know, we don't want to be having harsh, you know, harsh lines. In here we're getting a little bit more detailed, but we want to keep it overall as soft as we can. Again, just sort of looking at where those, like this one here, could probably be a wee bit lighter. Sort of bring that graphite powder up. Now when you feel that you're sort of losing the amount of graphite that you've got, you can just pick up another little bit. So just sort of slowly sort of working around. Again, here's nice and dark, so we could sort of get a good bit of that graphite powder just in that little section there of the rose. Same over here. Might even just pick up a little bit more of that powder. And if you do lay down more graphite that you intended, don't panic. You can come in and you can just lift that just with a you know, one of your erasers. Darker little section in here. And we can always just pick up a little bit. The good thing with these makeup applicators as well is you've got basically four sort of sides to it. So you can sort of keep one for, you know, your much darker sections, and then, you know, flip it over and use it for the lighter sort of areas that you're going to be working on. Just over here we can see that some of that darker pigment coming out. And when you're doing it, when you're putting these base layers down, try and follow the direction that you can see. You know, it's a little bit harder with this, but if you were doing it with fur, for example, you would be following the direction of the fur, even on these really sort of early stages. Some of these ones in here are just a tiny little bit darker. What we don't want to be doing is losing our lines. So if you feel that happens, just grab your HB. If I can, here it is. And what we can do then is just sort of come in, especially in here. This is quite a detailed little area here. So I'm actually going to come in with that and just sort of try and maybe just block in So we've got that rounded section there. This one sort of comes round. So we can come in over those lines again and just sort of pop in a few of those darker sort of areas, just so we don't lose them. Now when it comes to your pencils, I like to have a bit of a chiseled edge on my pencil. And by that I mean, if you can see that there. See how it's got a little bit of a slant on it there? And all I do to create that is just to take my pencil and give it a few swipes over some sandpaper. And you'll get that little sort of chiseled sort of edge. And that's what I use for most of my drawings. If I want a sharper sort of line or a darker line, I'll just rotate that pencil slightly so that I get more of that sharper edge. So it lets you use the one pencil, but do it with different sort of techniques. I'm just going to come back in, like I want this line here to be quite dark, that's coming down into this little shadowed area. Again, I'm just going to run that pencil along there. Same in here. And these little lines we don't want to lose. So I'm just going to come back and over the top. We can always just make any sort of adjustments as we go. And sort of add some, eraser marks and things like that if we feel we need to. But I think this is quite a detailed little sort of section of that rose. So we definitely don't want to be losing where those shapes and those petals are. A little line just there. Just sort of paying attention. And just down in here we can see is a lot darker. We just want to make sure that we're getting that shape. Line there's a wee bit darker, as is just this one coming in here. One right here as well. You can see how you can just slowly just sort of reinforce some of these darker sort of areas at the same time as you are working on your graphite powder. So never feel that just because, oh, I'm doing the graphite powder bit now, that you can't, you can't sort of come in with your pencil and just reinforce something. Because it's very easy sometimes to get lost in a drawing when there's so much sort of going on. And we've got a darker little section just in here. But I think the biggest thing I want to sort of say is, don't get too sort of caught up in getting every single little detail right. We're not going to be spending hours on this drawing. We're just going to be using our tones and our tonal values to sort of create that rose. I mean, if you wanted to, you could spend, unlimited amount of time. But I just wanted to sort of show you that, you can create something beautiful in a relatively short space of time. So all I'm doing now that I've sort of reinforced some of those marks so that I don't lose them, I'm just coming in with that, that eye makeup applicator, and I'm just sort of filling in the rest of the rows. Now, what's important with, using graphite or charcoal for that matter, is you need a layer of graphite down before you can lift the graphite off with your erasers. That makes sense. So, for example, you may have a really, really bright section on your drawing. So say, for example, it's the reflection in an eye, perhaps. You would then maybe just leave it as the paper. But not all paper is pure white either. But if you're going to be sort of wanting something to be really, really bright, then just don't put any graphite down on that paper. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to want a bit of graphite down so that you can then lift those highlights out with your erasers. So don't be sort of worried that you've got to, I've got to leave that little bit there because it's lighter, and don't be scared to just come in and just fill up the whole of that rose with a bit of graphite. And we can come back in once we've done that and have a look and see what needs to be darker. Now again, I don't want my base of my rose to be quite so dark. So if I feel like I need to just lift a little bit, I can just come along that transfer line. And I'm just sort of lifting it a little bit. Like I said, I probably would have done this before. If I was just drawing this for myself, I would have done this before I started sort of laying down any of the sort of powder. But again, I wanted you guys to sort of see that outline. And then I'll just come back in with that applicator and just fill in any of that little gap. Now, see, typical. And you see, I don't know if the camera can see it. You can see how I've just picked up a little bit of graphite. Either it's on my hand or I've smudged something. As soon as you see it, lift that off, especially if you're not doing a background. Just come in and just clean that area up. Keep that paper nice and clean. I've gone over my edge just a little bit over here. So again, I would just come in and just neaten that up. If you see it, then fix it. Like so. All right, now we can start building up a little bit more of that depth. So I'm going to come back in, pick up a little bit more of that graphite powder. And we're going to have a look and see again where it's darkest. So we've definitely got that dark section there. Also along this side here. A little bit sort of there. I think underneath here needs to be darkened down a little bit, just where that little part of that rose is sort of curling over. We want to capture that shadow. So this could all be just a little bit darker. Not as dark as here though. You've got to look at your tonal values when you're working, and especially in black and white. So you've got to be constantly sort of thinking to yourself, right, well, what's the darkest part? So we know that our leaves are really dark, for example, but when we're looking at the actual bud here of the rose, that little line in the middle is really dark. This section down here is really dark, and you're basing everything else off of that. So that's just the sort of things we're just going to be sort of looking out for. all I'm doing here is I'm just looking at the petals and I'm just sort of thinking, well, you know, where is there a darker little section maybe coming out from? You know, like I said, go in the direction that you're seeing those strokes. I think this side here could be a wee bit darker. And again, don't worry if you feel you've gone too dark, because we can lighten it up. Again, just a little bit darker just under here. Always remember, look out for these things. When you've got something like a flower and you can see that lighter section where that petal's curling over, that's where the light is hitting it. So it's going to be cast in that light. Underneath, it's going to be darker because it's being cast in a shadow. So just sort of keep that in mind as you go. If you can see that that top part of that petal is lighter, then what's underneath it is going to need to be in shadow. Alright, I think for our base layer with the powder, I'm quite happy with that. I don't think I want to go too much more with the powder. Maybe a little bit just up the top could be a wee bit darker. Again, you don't want to be losing your transfer lines. So if you do feel that you need to just come back in with that HB, you can always just darken that down a little bit. And then if you need to smooth it out, you can just come back in. And like I said, these are great because you can just turn it over. Same with a cotton bud. And you can just sort of give that a little soften if you think you've gone just a little bit too harsh, perhaps. I think I might be losing that little line there on that petal. Let me just pop that in. But remember, it doesn't have to be identical. Don't think, oh, I've missed a line there, or at the end of the day, reference image is just that, it's a reference. It doesn't matter if your rose looks different to someone else's. Okay, so let's just continue on with our HB pencil. So what I want to do is I want to just build upon what we've already done here. So over here, for example, is darker. Now use that chiseled edge of your pencil. And again, we're just starting to just sort of build up the depth, building up some of those tones that we can see. So again, we know that this is going to be cast into shadow because this one is sitting higher than this one. So this little inner edge here is going to be darker. So we can just sort of come in and add a bit more graphite to there. This section here we can see is a bit darker. So again, and we're not pressing hard here. Very, very light pressure. As soon as you start pressing too hard, you're going to end up burnishing that paper. Burnishing that paper basically means you're going to get that graphite shine a lot quicker. Now, don't get me wrong, it's the nature of the medium, so you will get a bit of shine with graphite. Unless you use the matte one that I mentioned earlier. But again, you're still going to get a wee bit. It's just the nature of the beast. The way to avoid that is light sort of layers. We want to just be ever so gently building up our layers. Now, if you've got multiple pencils, then we do that just by sort of stepping up through the pencils. if you're using just the one pencil, then obviously you just come in with a light layer first. Then you could come in with something a wee bit darker, just a little bit of more pressure, but you want to be doing it slowly. And you want to be building up. Because if you come in really, really heavy-handed, like I said, it's not only is it going to look a bit flat, but you will instantly get that shine. Now, because I'm not doing a background either, this is again something else we've got to consider. If we were doing a background, some of these edges would be quite sort of, light. But if we leave the edges light, it's going to change the shape of our rose. So sometimes you do have to just come in and put in the tiniest, little line just to sort of give you that edge. Otherwise, you're gonna lose the actual rose into the background. And sometimes if it's really subtle, I'll use something like a 7H pencil or something like that, something that's really fine. But again, it depends on what you've got and what you're using. Again, just really, really light, just sort of looking at where it is a bit darker. Just on this bottom little section here, on this petal, we can see that it's got just that darker little edge as it curls round, and then we've got these darker lines, so we can just come in and sort of pop them in a little bit more. A little line going up there. You're not going to get every single detail. What's important, and I'm guilty of this, I really am, is to try and not necessarily zoom into your reference image. When you're doing something, especially if it's a smaller scale drawing, if you're doing something larger, then this doesn't really apply. But if you're coming in and you are, you've got a reasonably small drawing, you're limited to how much detail you can pop in there, and you come in and you zoom in to your reference image, whether that be on your iPad or your mobile phone, whatever, your brain is going to see detail that you want to put down onto your paper. And when you're working on a smaller subject, that can actually be to your detriment, and it can actually make something look less realistic. So again, it's something just to keep in mind. Sometimes it's better, and I haven't done it in this instance, sometimes it's better to just print off your reference image to the size that you're drawing. And that sort of lets you see scale and detail, so that you're not trying to sort of push detail that's not there. I'm just coming in here, just on this little bit, it's a bit darker. Now, things dramatically change once you start adding, or sorry, I suppose it's subtracting. Once you start taking the graphite away with your erasers, things just change. So it's a bit of that sort of being a wee bit patient. I suppose it's like the ugly stage of your drawing. You've just got to sort of slowly sort of build and just sort of wait. And it's amazing how much it transforms once you do sort of start lifting some of those lighter sections out. But just stick with the process. Like I said, I'm still using that chiseled edge. I want everything to be quite soft. Just sort of working around, like this edge is reasonably dark. Again, I can just sort of change the angle of that pencil a little bit and just get a bit more of that sharper edge. And it just makes it a bit darker because we are using that sharper edge of the pencil. So that's why I was saying, you know, you can do a whole drawing with an HB pencil if you wanted to. Now just back over, because we're drawing on a flat piece of paper. We've got to create that shape. We want that to look like a rose. So this is where we've got to be aware of direction and tone. So where we can see on this back petal, for example, you can see that it's curling away. So how do we get that? We've got to use our tonal values for that and our direction. So we wouldn't want to be doing a straight across line like this, for example, because that's not going to make that look like the curve of that petal. So you've got to just have a look at your reference and just start popping these marks in that direction. You know, don't bring them all the way down. Up here is the darkest part of that petal, then it gets a wee bit lighter here. In here needs to be darker. So I'm just going to come in and just run that pencil just down in there. Same up in here. Just using a bit of that sharper edge. And as you can see, we're just slowly building up the tones. Again, don't forget this little one in here is nice and dark. You've got some little, just these petals sort of coming around here. Just making sure that we're getting those little marks in. This one in here was darker. And we can just add a little bit of that HB in there. Now, as I said earlier, when it comes to, you know, your lights and your darks, you'll find your own rhythm as to what works for you. And that can change, you know, depending on the drawing you're doing. I mean, I know for me, I change it, you know, on a regular sort of basis. But if you feel that you need some of that lighter tones in there, just to sort of help you out, you know, just to guide you slightly, then don't be afraid to come in and lift those lighter ones out. Not only does it sometimes give you a bit of a reference point, you know, something to actually look at and see, especially when you're doing a more complicated sort of drawing, then, you know, that makes all the difference sometimes if you can just have that lighter sort of tone just to work off of. I think it does sort of help our brains sometimes. I think I'm about done with my HB. Now I'm going to use a couple of other pencils with this, but like I said, there's no reason you cannot continue on just using the HB pencil if that's all you've got, because like I said, just by using that pencil from a chiseled edge with light pressure to a chiseled edge with a bit harder pressure, or moving your pencil into more of that point, so you can get that darker line. So by all means, just, you know, if you are using just the one pencil, carry on with that you know, with that pencil. Don't think that you can't continue your drawing because, you know, like I said, lots of artists just use one pencil. I'm just going to come and just put a little bit more detail just into here, get that shape. Again, I'm not pressing hard at any point here, keeping it lovely and soft. So I'm going to come in and I'm just going to step it up now. And this is what I do in most of my tutorials with my graphite, is I'll work up the pencil. So I'll start with an HB, and then I might come in and do a bit of the 2B. And then the 4B will be on just the really darker sections and so forth. So like I said, you're coming in light with your layers, which eliminates a bit of that graphite shine. So I'll just grab my 2B. So again, nice light pressure. You can see how just it's a little bit softer just because we're stepping up through those B's. And just sort of adding a little bit of that. Now, again, as we step up through our pencils, you don't necessarily want to be putting, especially for this drawing, you know, some other drawings might be a little bit different, but we don't want to be adding this 2B everywhere if we don't need to, because otherwise it's just going to be all samey and just be, you know, just exactly like it looks now, but darker. So we do want to just, again, keep our pressure light and just picking up those sort of darker little sections. So take your time, like we know that this little one here is darker, so we'd want to add a bit more of the 2B there. Same up here, we could add the 2B there because it is darker. But on these really light sort of sections, I've got a darker little one here too that I've sort of missed. Yeah, with those, you know, lighter sort of sections of the flower, we don't necessarily want to be coming in and darkening those areas down. Now, if you ever feel at any point that you want to just soften what you've put down, just grab a clean blender. You don't want something that's got graphite powder on it, and just give it a soften. For something as small as this, the Q-tip is perfect. You know, just you can come across every little stroke that you did if you wanted to, and just give that a wee soften, a wee blend. And it just sort of softens the whole look. Now you can do this a little bit later if you want in the process, but it's nice sometimes to put a layer down or a couple of layers and then come in and do this. Now if you were doing a bigger scale, you could use a piece of tissue paper for this. Just sort of wrap it around your finger and do exactly the same as you're doing here. Like I said, if you're wanting to use like a paper stump or something like that, just be mindful that it's not covered in a load of graphite. You can see how that just sort of, it does just smooth it out and keeps it sort of nice and soft, like so. All right, back with that 2B again, and again, sort of just looking at those darker sections. Now again, you can use the sharper sort of edge of the pencil if you want things to look a little bit darker. You can see what a difference that's just made there. And then I'm going to do the same over just on this side here. Now I say this in all of my tutorials, is don't be afraid of your darks. Getting those darks in is what really is going to make your artwork pop. And people are nervous. I was nervous when I first started. You know, you get nervous because you think, oh my God, if I make this too dark, it's just going to look stupid. But it doesn't. It is what is going to make your drawing. It really is. You need that contrast. If you don't get that contrast in, it's just going to look flat. Really, really flat. Just sort of, again, just coming in and just exaggerating with that pencil where those darker little areas are. Again, I'm not pressing hard, nice and soft. I'm not stressing about these little lines I can see. Like I said, it's back to that trying to push detail where it doesn't really belong. Use just your tones, use just your strokes. It's amazing what your brain will fill in. You know, when someone's looking at your drawing, you don't have to have every single detail in there, because someone will stand back. Always, that's another tip, always sort of stand back and look at your drawing at a distance that someone would look at your drawing. While we're drawing, we have a tendency to be quite close to the paper. And it gets to the point that your brain, that's all your brain sees, is that close-up. And you're constantly struggling with how something looks. Stop. Take a bit of a step back. Have a look. You know? Someone isn't going to have their nose pressed up against your drawing when it's hanging on the wall or if it's hanging in a gallery. People stand back, look at things from a distance. We need a bit more depth going on inside this sort of bud of the rose. So again, just have a look at your reference image and just start adding some of that darker tone in there. Building up a bit of that shape. Again, there's a fair bit of detail going on in here, so don't put too much pressure on yourself to get every little bit exactly how it is. And remember, once we start adding, taking away some of those graphite marks, we're going to end up, getting those petals popping out a little bit more. Again, just if you think it could be doing with being a little bit darker, exaggerate something a little bit. I mean, this will completely be transformed when we lift some of this graphite powder off, for example. So just slow and steady. And then again, you can come in with your blender. Give everything a wee bit of a soften. And it depends. I mean, you've got to sort of decide as well how you want your art to look. We're all individuals, and that is the beauty of art, is that we can decide, do we want something to look quite sort of textured? Is that the sort of look we want in our art? Or do we want to be sort of hyper-realistic artists? In which case you're spending, potentially upwards of 40, 50. Sometimes some artists you see on social media have spent, 100 hours doing a drawing. I love my art, but I do not, and I don't know if I ever would, have the time to spend 100 hours on a drawing. Obviously, if you're selling your artwork or you are presenting a lot to galleries and things like that, then that's what you would need to do. But for me and for the love of my art and sort of teaching people how to draw, not everyone has that amount of time. If it is not your profession as such, you guys aren't going to have, you might have an afternoon to create something beautiful. And, my job is to let you know that you can. You certainly can. Now, another great thing with these Q-tips, I find sort of more than some other blenders, is that you get a build-up, right, of the whatever medium you're using. And I love to take that and then put it somewhere. So for example, if you wanted to darken down this little section here, for example, you could come in with what's on that Q-tip and just sort of add it there. You can see how that's just added a very subtle little shadow. So you don't need to come in and think, oh, I've got to get my pencil and darken that down. Sometimes all you need is just that little bit of that medium that's on your blender. All right, I'm going to step up to my 4B. Again, don't worry if you don't have a range of pencils, but when you get to a 4B, that's when you want to start being very mindful about where you're putting it down, because you're getting up into that really soft territory now. So you do want to just apply this where it's needed. Otherwise, you're going to end up making everything too dark, and that's not what we want. You do want to be reinforcing those darker areas, but we only want to do it where it needs to go. Again, this little section here we know is darker. In fact, it's really dark in there, and we'll come to that as we sort of go. And I'll explain just a couple of other sort of ways you can get those areas nice and dark. Again, I'm just constantly sort of gazing up at my reference image. Like in here is probably darker. That shadow sort of coming out a little bit more there. Again, nice light pressure. This darker sort of line here. Just exaggerate that just a little bit. Again, looking at the shape. That's important. Again, we can come in with that blender, and we can always just soften. We can push it out a little bit. Again, use what's on that Q-tip if we want to just sort of add a little bit of depth to other areas. Again, I'm just going to come back in. I want this to be nice and dark. So this is just the 4B. This needs to be darker here, because this part of the rose is the closest to us. So this bottom section here is more in shadow. So again, just nice light pressure. Bringing up just some of that darker pigment. Again, come in with your Q-tip. Soften out those strokes. Blend, when you're blending as well, blend in the direction that your strokes went. You know, don't be coming in and going that way if your strokes were going up that way, because that's the shape of that petal. That petal is going up and out. So it's just as important with your blending that you're paying attention to those directions. I've probably in hindsight gone a wee bit too dark there, but I'm not going to stress, because I'm going to fix that up once we start pulling out some of those lighter sections. It changes what's going on sort of roundabout. I think this line here needs to be a wee bit darker, so I'm just going to come up and just darken that down a little bit. I think underneath here as well, again, this lighter section at the top is going to cast that shadow underneath. And probably under here as well. Got a little bit of the shape to that petal that I've probably lost. And again, just coming in, adding a little bit of that pigment. Darkening down these little lines at the side here. Tiny little bit just on that edge. And then I want to soften this. This is too harsh. Again, just in with your blender. Right. Now, what I want to do now is I do want to start bringing some of these lighter sections out on that rose. I'm going to use actually I might come in and use the pencil eraser. But you use whatever eraser you have. If you're only using a kneadable eraser, just break a little bit off and then you can mold it into the shape that you want. So again, we're going to look at our reference image and we're going to see where these lightest sections are. We're not worrying about it being the be all and end all at the moment. This is just so we can get that little bit of a variance in our tones. Again, I find it just sort of helps your brain a little bit. So just a close look. Again, when we're lifting these, don't think they're any different to what you would be doing with a pencil. So you want to be going in the shape, for example, of your petal. And just sort of gently. Now you might encounter an area where you think, oh, it needs to be a wee bit darker. So don't be scared just to pick up your pencil and just darken down a section. You know, don't think it just because we've started lifting with our eraser that we can't come in and use our pencils at the same time. I am so guilty sometimes of having sometimes up to 20 pencils sitting in my hand. Not so much with my graphites, but when I do a pastel drawing, yeah, I hold on to them just in case I just want to sort of tweak something, or, and I'm constantly clearing away those little crumbles. And look at how, if it's darker on the edge, look at where this lighter section is coming round. Create that shape. Again, clear some of those crumbles. I need to sort of exaggerate this line a little bit. This is what I was meaning about coming back in. I'm just going to grab maybe the 2B and just the shape of the flower. Just sort of lost that line, just sort of joining those two together. That's better. And then I've got to just have a look in here. I've got that line sort of coming down just where it's getting into that really sort of dark section. Again, a little bit sort of darker there, darker here. Because once you start lightening things, the area next to it changes. So we're constantly evolving, you know, how our drawing is looking. Again, if you feel that it needs a wee bit of a blend, a wee bit of a soften, just come in and just give that just a wee push down into your paper. So now that we've sort of made that a little bit sort of darker, we can then sort of see what needs to be a bit lighter. So we know we need to sort of run along this edge of that sort of top edge of that petal. Again, get rid of the crumbles so that you can see what you're doing. And this is light over here. You get your shape. That's why I like these pencil sort of style erasers, because you're using them to sort of draw like you would a pencil, which can be quite handy, I think, when especially when you're sort of starting out, because we all kind of know how to use a pencil. So again, I'm not sort of lifting it all, I'm just sort of looking at the reference, seeing where some of these lighter sort of strokes are, creating a bit of texture, I suppose. Now again, the bottom section of this rose is going to be tricky to sort of determine until we get this dark, because this is going to be really quite dark, and that is going to change how our, you know, how our actual base of our rose is going to look. Again, I'm just sort of pulling just some of those lighter ones, and if you feel that you've gone, you know, a little bit too light, then come in and soften it with your Q-tip. Again, we've got this little sort of point here on the top little edge. Just get that little shape in there. Like I said, you don't need to try and get every single one, but if you can sort of really sort of see something within the drawing that you think, oh yeah, no, I'll sort of lighten that, I'll get that little bit of detail in there. You don't need every detail, but if you can get in there and just add the main ones, it's amazing, like I said, how people's brains will fill in the gaps. going to start sort of coming in more now and creating a bit more of that shape in that sort of center of our rose. I'm just going to come in and just lighten in here just a little bit. Again, look at the direction, look at the shape. You want to be creating the shape of that petal best as you can. You do that with your graphite pencils, but you also do that with, by using your erasers as well. Lighter in there. This one definitely needs to be a lot brighter. This line here coming across. I'm going to sort of lighten that up a little bit. And again, you need to have a look at your drawing. You might not need to lift, some of the graphite off where I have, for example. What you've got to sort of learn to do is just look at that reference and see where's my lighter sections. I think in here needs to be a little bit darker. So I've got that 2B in my hand, so I'm just going to use that. I just want to darken just this little section in here. Again, I'm just sort of looking. I think this up here could be a wee bit darker, just above. Again, I'm just using that sort of chiseled edge there. Again, I have probably sort of lost a little bit of this, this sort of inner part of that bud. But I'm not going to stress about it. It is what it is. And just darkening a few little bits, then we can come back in with our eraser. And we can sort of lift a little bit. I think again, this little section here needs to be a wee bit darker. Like I said, have a wee bit of a sit back. I think we need a little bit of lightness just as it comes down here on mine. You can see again, by adding or subtracting, we're creating the shape. Again, why our direction is important. like I said, when our brains are sort of filling in these sort of things, we don't want to be distracting it by things going in the wrong direction. And all I'm doing here is, now that I've sort of taken a little bit of that graphite away, just sort of softening it. Up here I can see needs to be lighter, just on the edge here of this petal. Now, this is a really good example of taking away the graphite there, but it's still not looking right. So what you can do is just darken this petal. This petal needs to be darker behind it, which will automatically make this petal lighter and stand out more. So we can come in, you could come in with your, your HB. And sometimes I recommend that too. Come back in with, starting back at your HB. Don't, necessarily need to go in and pop in, a 4B there. That would be way too dark. But something just light and subtle. Because sometimes it doesn't need much. You see, even that little bit there, we're getting a little bit more of that petal standing out. I think the tip of this one, for example, could be a bit darker. So just with that HB, we can just come in and just darken that little section there. Make that stand out. Still think this could probably be a wee bit darker. But sometimes just a little, that little outline is all we need. Okay, I'm just getting a bit of that shape. And then again, if you need to just lighten something, we can just come in with that eraser. Alright, I'm not going to work too much more on that rose until we get this bottom little section in here. So let's get stuck into that. Now I do want to put in some graphite powder on there. So I'm just going to grab my little makeup applicator. I'll quickly show you doing it with a Q-tip. So I'm just, again, doing the same process. I'm picking it up with my Q-tip and rubbing it on that paper. And then you can just come in. You see how it's just no different. And sometimes if you're working on a smaller sort of area, this might actually work a little bit better because you've got a bit more control, obviously, because of the size of the tips of these things. But I just want to just sort of show you the difference. But actually, I might just continue with my Q-tip. I think it would be a good way to sort of show you how this all sort of works. Be careful in this little one here. It's quite a small little leaf. If you're a bit nervous, just come in with a pencil and use your pencil there. And I'm just going to come in and just get that first layer. Now again, if you feel that you're sort of losing your your transfer lines, just have a pencil in your hand so that you can actually come in and just reinforce some of those lines. A lot of these are, I've put them onto the the line art, but these are more the lighter ones that we're going to pull out. So in hindsight, just coming in and putting this graphite powder down is probably the way to go, and then we'll just manually lift out some of these lighter sort of veins that are coming through. What's important here is looking at your reference and seeing what's darker. So we know, for example, on this one here, this side is darker. We can see that. This side on this one is probably a wee bit darker. So when we're putting down our base layers, that's the sort of thing that we're looking for. You know, we want to come in and get those darker little sections in first. We're trying to build up probably a bit of form, I suppose you would say, with our base layers. And that's why I like to come in and do my darker sort of sections first, and then when you've got hardly any pigment left, you can then come in and go over the top. Now when you're working on these smaller sort of things like these leaves, that can be a wee bit trickier, so just ease up on a bit of the pressure when it's a lighter sort of section. Now I'm going to grab I might even grab the 2B, because it's quite dark under here. So I just want to get the shape of that little section just underneath there on that stalk. And then all I'm going to do again, I'm just going to come in and just fill that in. Just take your time. Like I said, you can use a paper stump here. And if you're a bit worried with these little sort of thorns, then just don't put your graphite powder there. We can blend those out a little bit. We can use our pencils. So if you're, you know, a little bit unsure, or, you know, we all have those days where our hands are a wee bit on the shaky side. But if you do go over your line, then just immediately grab your eraser and just fix that up. Some of these are just really, really little, even for a, you know, even for a Q-tip. I'm going to darken this leaf down a little bit. And that's why I like using the graphite powder as a base, because look how much quicker it is. You know, you're getting this base down really quickly, which is such a time saver. And again, I'm going in the direction. Again, we can pick up a little bit more. Like I said, these are quite dark. And if you feel that your Q-tip's getting a little bit sort of raggedy, just turn it over. Just get a nice new edge. You can see I'm just sort of working my way up, trying to create that little jagged edge. Just being careful not to come over, especially if you're keeping your background just that white like I am. And you can see how I'm now, even with this layer, going in that direction. We want to be going in the direction of whatever it is that's above it. Even in these base layers, it's important. Again, just sort of working along. Hope you can see that and I'm not sort of obscuring the camera. Again, not stressing too much about these little veins. We'll be brave and do those manually. Again, you want to be looking at your tonal values. These leaves are dark. So this is one of those instances where, you know, we don't need to be so aware of how much graphite we're putting down. We can come in. And you can see that we're sort of building up a bit of texture as we go because of those strokes that we're doing. So you're sort of getting the gist of that leaf sort of texture before we've even really done anything. I'm not going to be brave enough, I don't think, to come in and do that little stalk. I think I'll come in with a pencil for that one. I'm just going to get this last little leaf. Now, I don't like moving my drawings around when I'm filming, but a great thing to do is always, I've got mine on a board like that. I've actually taped my board to my table, but if you don't do that, you can then lift that board up and you can move your drawing. So if you're getting to a little section of your drawing that's a little bit awkward for your hand, then just come in and just move the board. Doesn't matter if your drawing's upside down. If it's easier for you to get to the bit that you're working on, then that's ideal. Like I said, I don't, purely because I think it's a little bit distracting when I'm actually doing a tutorial. I'm just coming back down, just darkening down that little stalk or stem, like so. Have a look if there's any sort of little sections need to be a wee bit darker. Again, make things easier for yourself. You know, if you can sort of block it in and make things a bit darker now, then you haven't got to do as much work with your actual, with your actual pencils. And we know these leaves are dark. But just get to the stage where you're happy. Like I said, direction's important. I know I'll sort of hammer that a bit, but it is. All right. Again, I'm just gonna very gently have a quick look. Is there any sort of little areas that I've maybe got a bit of graphite dropped? We just give it a wee bit of a clean up. Like I said, clean up as you go. All right. So we'll start back with our HB. And again, if that's all you've got, then just work away with it. I'm just going to move my glass in a little bit. We're just going to start working on these leaves. So again, I'm going, because I'm getting into more detail, I'm just sort of rotating that pencil a little bit so I can get a finer edge. And then if I need to, I can come back more onto that chiseled edge. Again, I'm looking at where the darker area is on that leaf. I'm just going to come around the bottom of the rose there. Get that shape a bit better. And here is really dark underneath. And then I'm just going to run right along, just so that I make sure I get that shape right. Same just on this leaf here. Right. Same thing, just sort of coming down that shape, using sharper edge on that pencil if we need to. Coming in and just popping a couple of those little sort of spikes. Quite light over here. I'm only going to sort of come in and sort of concentrate more on this darker section. what we want to be trying to do is we're seeing past, you know, the lighter sections we can see. And that can get a little bit hard to get used to. And if you do struggle, like I say, just come in and just, you know, if you feel that you need to add a lighter edge on one of these leaves now, then, you know, that's what you need to do. It's whatever makes the process, you know, easier for you. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun and enjoyable process. Otherwise, you know, why would we want to do it? You know, you can get, I love working with graphite. I really do. Graphite and charcoal. I've always loved sort of the black and white images. If I ever sort of are looking for reference images and things, it's just, my eye is just instantly drawn, you know, to black and white. It's a beautiful medium to work with. It is forgiving. Okay, I'm just sort of building up. This is still my HB pencil. I'm not pressing hard. We've got some of these little sort of spikes just coming out. So we can just very gently just pull a couple of them out. Same here. Again, you can use that sharper point on your pencil. Darkening down just under here a little bit. Again, just to sort of get the shape of that. Shape of that little sort of stalk or stem. Darker under there. Okay. Now carry on. If you're just using an HB, just carry on building it up. I'm going to come in with the 2B. Again, I'm just sort of looking at where these darker sections are. Some of my little spikes on this side. Pull out a few, like I said. We don't have to think, oh my god, there's 7 of those, I've got to do 7. And then back in just with that chiseled edge on that 2B. And then the pointier end if you want it to be a little bit sharper. Again, we know it's nice and dark just underneath there. You can see that there's that lighter section there. Again, we're going with the movement of that leaf. And that's where these tones are really important. It's like when you're doing, if you're doing like the structure on an animal's face. Horses are, you know, the best example of that, because there's so much form and structure in a horse, even in its body. And that's where getting these lights and darks right are really important. Sometimes, you know, tone isn't the be all and end all, but when you're trying to build structure on something, then it is so important. Just run that pencil just up the edge of that rose. I think that needs to be just a wee bit darker. Right. Now with the 2B, I'm just going to come in and just come over the top. I'm easing up on my pressure just a little bit on this side because it is a little bit lighter there. I might step back to the HB just for getting the base layer down on these little thorns that I wasn't quite game enough to use the Q-tip for. I'm just coming in and just filling in. And I'm not worrying about detail in that at the moment. I just want to get that probably come in a little bit too much there. I need to erase that a little tiny bit. I might just grab my Tombow eraser. Just want that to sort of stand out a little bit more. And then just back over here with that HB. Trying to decide whether we'll sort of work on that separately or just do the whole thing. I think I'll just do the whole thing. I think while we've got pencils in our hand, let's just go over the whole parts, I think. But again, that's very much so I've done the same thing here. I've sort of gone just a little bit off. I'm just going to just erase that and then come back in with my HB, try and get that little thorn popped in there, looking a little bit better. Yeah, it's very much an individual thing really about how we like to work, you know, with any medium we use. Some people like to work in small sections, some people like to, you know, sort of come in and block everything in first. I must admit, I do, again, a chop and change. It is one of those things. I think it depends on how you feel and what you're drawing as well. I'm just coming along here and just where I wasn't sort of brave enough to come right to the edge, I'm just grabbing that HB and I'm just pulling that HB out into those sort of little bits of those leaves. So yeah, so it again, it does sometimes depend on what it is you're actually drawing, and I chop and change a little bit just depending on, you know, how I want to sort of teach a specific, you know, tutorial perhaps. But you'll find your way, you'll find your method of working and what works for you. You might be just work on a small part, you might be an all or nothing, so just get in there and get the, you know, get base layers in, and it is really completely up to you. Like I said, I'm just sort of coming back in and around, making sure that I've got a layer of graphite on all of those little parts of those leaves. Again, you can go back more onto that sharper sort of edge of that pencil if you just want to get a little bit more detail in there. And you can always just come back in and over that leaf. Again, going in the direction. That's important. We might not really see these strokes that well because, you know, I'm using an 8B pencil for my graphite powder, so but it's amazing just adding, just even coming over the top of that base layer with the HB. You still get that texture, you still get a bit of that change in that tone. Sure. These little bits are dark enough. And then again, just the same with this one, just making sure. Again, this would be one of those sort of times that you could actually sort of rotate your board a little bit. Sometimes I have to sort of contort myself into these different sort of angles. But if it's easier for you, just move your board. That's why I always suggest putting your drawing paper, taping it to a board, not just for things like this while you're drawing, but I mean, if you're finished drawing for the day and you're using your kitchen table, the last thing you want to do is have to sort of work around what's there. You can lift it up and you can put it somewhere safe. So that's an added benefit, making it a bit more mobile. All right, I'm going to step it up to the 2B. Again, I'm going to come in, I'm just going to darken down again, just a little bit more of that center sort of stem. Again, using the chiseled edge. If you feel that you've sort of lost the shape or anything, you can always just sort of come along that edge with your eraser. Yeah, tidy it up. And just run 2B along there. And I'm easing up on my pressure on this side because it is just a wee bit lighter. Again, same sort of thing, just going in that direction. Into that 2B. Again, move your art if you feel you need to. It's just an easier angle for you to work at. Right. Tidy up that just a little bit. I think I've just sort of lost my shape there just a little bit. The good thing is as well, if you're if you're not putting a background in, you can sort of come in with your eraser a little bit and just create a little bit more of that jagged edge if you feel that it's not quite not quite the right sort of shape for you. But one thing to be aware of, especially when you're coming onto sort of plain sort of paper, is that if you've got any graphite sitting on your eraser and you deposit it down onto your paper, you're going to get that graphite on your paper. So you don't end up with little dots. I'm just coming back in here just with the 2B again, just to sort of soften those edges a little bit. Darker just in that little section there of that sort of stem. These little sort of thorns that are coming out are quite dark. Again, we can just turn that pencil over, get a little bit of that sharper edge, make those sort of stand out a little bit more. Again, just coming down into here with that 2B. Going in the direction of that leaf. Creating a bit more of that texture. And just the same on this one. Tip of that leaf curling round. Right, let's have another look up in here. I might grab the 4B. Again, just on these darkest sections, because we're getting into that really darker sort of territory now when we start using the 4. I'm just sort of picking up where it's really dark. Like that little, what do we call it, a horn there. That little thorn is quite dark. And under here, we know that this is lovely and dark. A bit of that 4B in there. Same in that sort of little section just underneath. And a bit of that 4B just down. Doesn't go all the way to the edge. It sort of runs just at the front. Just sort of, I think I might have gone a little bit too thick just there. I need to give that a clean up. Like I said, pay attention to what's on your eraser. Any of that little crumbles. Okay, for this little thorn wrong as well. you can see as those little thorns come out, you've got that darker section. This one's a prime example. So it's dark just in here. And then it sort of comes out a wee bit darker. And then it's a bit lighter underneath. My little thorn needs to be darker overall. But you can see how, same here, you can see that there's that darker section just above that thorn. Did I just call that a horn? I might have done. You guys know what I mean. And again, just, it's important that we look for these shifts in those tonal values. Like I said, that's what sort of gives us that depth and that shape. There's a bit of a line that's coming down just here, just where it's a bit darker. Now with the 4B, I'm going to do the same thing. And just to make things a bit easier for ourselves, like we've been doing already, just keep sort of building up that sort of vein structure, you know, on our leaves. You know, see where they're coming out, and just pulling those through and into the center. Same down here. Just sort of coming in. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a huge amount of detail. You know, we're not spending 40 hours on this drawing. Yeah, if you want to come in and put every single little bit of detail in here, then, you know, by all means. But I think just for the nature of this one, let's just keep it simple. Again, just building up that texture. Building up the shape of that leaf. We can always sort of tweak this as well once we get those lighter areas in. Okay. Come back up just to this section here. And just add a bit of that 4B. Dark just underneath that rose there. Where you can sort of start, once you start sort of seeing what's going on around about, you can see what little adjustments you do need to make. Darker just on this little side here. Little tips. Again, you see something that just needs just that little bit of adjustment. Because like I say, once you start putting an area round about something else, it's amazing how much it can drastically change what it is that you see on what you've already done. So it's constantly evolving. It's really important that you don't sort of, you know, you work on a little area and you just say, okay, I'm just going to stop there for a little bit and I'll move on. Because as soon as you put an area, especially if there's a significant difference in the tone, then it's going to look completely different. What you've drawn is going to look different, and you are going to have to make adjustments. Now I'm just going to come in with that Q-tip, and I just want to come in and around, and I just want to soften and smooth out this leaf. Again, I'm blending in the direction of those strokes that I've already done. Careful not to sort of come out too far. We'll probably tweak some of these little edges just at the end, just to get those leaves looking a little bit nicer. Same here, just anywhere that you've just sort of added a bit of that pigment. Again, this is the perfect sort of time when you're coming over something darker. Use that Q-tip to, you know, add some subtle shading to your rose, for example. So in here, see how that's just beautiful and subtle. Same here on this side. So you're using the pigment that you've got on that Q-tip. I love it. I love the softness of it. I love just how you can add just the tiniest little bit of shading and detail just by using the pigment that you already had on something you were going to throw away. Yeah, same in here. Just again, only using what you had on that Q-tip. Make sure that it's I don't get any sort of little loose crumbly bits. All right, I think we need to start lifting a little bit again on here. So again, I'm just going to use my little pencil one to start with. I might need, because it's not the sharpest of tips, this one, this is where the Tombow eraser is really good. Because what you can do is you can actually cut, again, a chiseled edge like you do in your pencils. And it gives you that lovely sort of edge. So for example, this little section just in here, I think I need the Tombow in there just to lift that a little bit. I might come back with the pencil and just use it for in here. And this is where having, you know, you don't have to, but this is where having just a selection of erasers is great, because you can chop and change. You know, you can decide what's going to work for that specific, you know, part of your drawing. You know, like I might think, well, that pencil's not going to be sharp enough for that edge, so I might come back in and use the Tombow eraser there. You know, you can come in and do those little lines, those little veins. It's quite a powerful eraser, the Tombow eraser. So just be careful of your pressure. And again, it's a practice thing. Again, I can see by doing that section below how much lighter this little section here needs to be. And then I've got a tiny little darker section there. So I can just come in and just with the HB, just making sure I'm getting that sort of shape right. And just make sure you've got no crumbles. I mean, we've got little veins and little marks on these leaves, for example. Don't try and zoom in, like I said. Take your pencil and your eraser and just a few little dabs. You know, come in and just sort of tap it like that. And that sometimes is all it takes just to create, you know, a little bit of that sort of texture that you're trying to achieve. A little bit darker just in the top edge here. Okay, have a bit of a look. Lightening up my pressure here. I don't want to be having like a strip coming down. But if I can see it needs to be, again, just some little bits that are just a little bit lighter. Just run your eraser down. Try it with the pencil one on these leaves. But it might not be quite distinct enough. Let's have a look, see what I think. Not too bad. Let's try it with the Tombow, just so I can show you the difference. I think not much difference to it really. I might use the Tombow for the one in the middle. Now again, don't worry if you feel that you've lifted too much of that pigment off, because we can come back and we can fix that. Again, this is one of those times you would probably move your drawing. So I'm going to do mine, try and do mine in a bit of a stage. I'm going to make sure I'm not smudging my drawing, leaning over the top of it. And then we can always sort of come down and sort of join the two. I've gone a bit sort of wide there, but that's the sort of time you would just come in and just adjust it. Use your, you know, your Q-tip or whatever it is you've been using. That's a great thing about graphite. It's so forgiving. Just going to come in and get this little center little part on this one done. And then we can sort of just, again, just sort of pulling out. Some of these are a lot darker, like they're much darker here. So again, this is where we've just got to look at our reference image. I'm not stressing too much about cleaning my eraser here. If you're trying to get a really nice bright highlight, you want to make sure those tips of your erasers are clean. So with these Tombow ones, I would just slice with my craft knife, just a tiny little slither off of that to give me a clean edge. But when you're not overly concerned about it being too bright, then it doesn't matter. You can go quite a long time using your erasers, you know, without having to sort of stress about getting that really pristine sort of line. So just remember that having the amount of graphite you have on your eraser, whatever eraser that may be, will determine how bright, you know, your actual, you know, highlights look. Now I think this has got to be a lot brighter. I just need to come along pressing a little bit harder. Get these little sort of center ones standing out a little bit more. All right. Okay, so that's helped us a fair bit. Now we can come back in and just sort of hone in and sort of darken things down a bit. Now we can step up. We've used our 4B. We've got a couple of other options. We've got normal sort of sets. We'd have maybe a 7B and then a 9B. So if you really wanted to get something dark, you could come in, for example, with a bit of 9B, and you can darken little areas right down. Now, like I said, you wouldn't be pulling this pencil over the whole area if it doesn't need it. What you are doing is using that as your darkest sort of dark. Like these little stems, for example, or little stalks. You could run just a little bit. Just be careful. Again, you could always come in with a 7B first if you were wanting to sort of step your way up. But if you've only got maybe an HB and a 6B, like I mentioned at the start, then, you know, you work with what you've got. And it all comes down to then sort of using pressure and this sort of strokes. So we'll use this one for example. We can see that we need to darken down here. So where I've sort of drawn my lighter lines, you can see it on the reference image. You've got the lighter line and then you've got a darker line immediately above it. So if we just sort of come over the top of where I've sort of drawn those lighter strokes, we can then start to sort of darken down sort of in between. You can just see how it just sort of gives your drawing just a little bit more depth. There's a darker line sort of running along that sort of center sort of vein. Now another pencil, which I didn't mention at the beginning, is a mechanical pencil. If you can get yourself a hold of these, I use these all the time just for finishing touches. Now this is a 0.7, you know, it all varies on the size, and it's a 2B lead. So it's not an overly dark lead, but because it is so small, you can get the most brilliant sort of details. I'll show you a little bit just in here. So you can come back in over the top and see how much darker that is. Same with this little one here. And it just gives you that most beautiful depth. It's like using your darkest black, even though it's, like I said, it's a 2B. It's still, and again, if you've got one of these, you could do your whole drawing with one of these pencils. And again, it all comes down to just how light you are in your touch. Yeah? I don't usually use these, like I said, on sort of larger scales. This would be on those final details, like this little bit here of that. Needs to be nice and dark. You know, that little thorn there, perhaps. Up in under here. Get that lovely and dark. So these mechanical pencils, if you can, you know, get yourself a hold of them, and they're everywhere. You get them at, you know, art supply stores and things like that. You can buy them online. There was a special on, and I actually got a set of them, and I haven't touched the rest of them. I only use this one. But again, play around. If you have a look, and if you get something on special, I'm a great one for keeping an eye open for sales. I hate paying for, you know, full price for anything. So yeah, just keep your eye open. You don't have to rush and get these sort of things. But again, it's a brilliant one just to get that really fine detail. You can see how I can just get a much finer line. I mean, just look at the two pencils together. You know, there's really no comparison on how thin these are. And they're great because it's a mechanical pencil. You just press the little button at the end and they instantly got some more lead. So for this one, for example, same sort of thing. It's a little bit darker, just on that edge of that lighter section. Now, if you haven't got the mechanical pencil, don't worry. Yeah, like I said, just come back in. Yeah, even if you're just working on your HB, you know, just come in and just apply a little bit more pressure. This is just the 9B in my Derwent set that I've got. Again, look at your reference, see where those darker areas are. Like I said, I'm not going to stress about getting all these tiny little veins. We might try and sort of pull a few through. Again, if we've got darker little sections, just try and create the texture of your leaf, just using that darker pencil. Like I said, we're not looking at getting it identical to our reference. The reference is just that, it's a reference. Same here. In this one we've actually got the darker sort of lines coming through as opposed to those lighter ones. You could add just a few of those in there. Again, top part of that lighter vein is dark, so I'm just going to use my mechanical pencil because I've got it. And then just underneath again, we can just bring in our 9B, have a look and see where that darker little sections are. Now, if we did want to sort of sharpen up some of these, that's where a mechanical pencil is really good, because again, you can come in here, you've got a lovely sort of point. So these are fantastic, like I said, just for getting those beautiful details. Then down here, a couple of these could just be a little bit sharper. Remember what I said, if you're, you know, if you want to spend 8 hours doing this drawing, you know, you're going to end up with, you know, a much higher level of realism than we are sort of doing a 2.5 hour drawing. Again, just sort of looking at some of these little thorns. They could be a little bit darker. A little bit of that highlight. Just coming around and onto that little little bit there of that stem. Probably be darker. Again, this is just my 9B. Again, you've got these sort of little sort of veins sort of coming through. Rather than sort of trying to get every individual one, take your eraser and just dabs, you know, just sort of little sort of dots, and you can sort of go in the direction that they're actually on, you know, the reference, but you're not sort of thinking, oh, I've got to draw a wee vein there and a wee vein there. We're just building up, you know, just a little bit of variety. Some of them you won't really see. You need to sort of lighten something up a little bit. This little ones down here could probably be a little bit sort of sharper. I'm just going to use my mechanical pencil to give a little bit more shape. Now, like I said, have a wee bit of a sit back, step back and away from your drawing. But for me, I think I need to darken down more in these leaves. So I'm just taking my 9B and I'm just sort of glazing it, just sort of over. Some of these probably need a little bit of attention. These little sort of barbs coming out. I'm just going to cut myself a fresh edge just so that I'm not going to dirty my paper. There's no graphite on there. You can just sort of, like I said, just sort of neaten it up a little bit. Like I said, you've always got to be realistic based off of the time that you're spending on your drawing. So by all means, when I'm sort of, you know, we're finished here, keep working on it. Oh, try not to throw your pencil at yourself. Yeah, keep working, keep having a look. What can you do, you know, to improve your drawing? Step back, have a look at the tonal value. A great way of determining if you've got something dark enough and you're happy with it is take a photo. Take a photo on your phone. Go and have a sit down, have a cup of coffee, whatever it may be, and have a look. It's amazing how something will jump out at you a hell of a lot more than when you've got your nose pressed up to your drawing. You can't see the, you know, the forest from the trees. Again, just making any sort of little tweaks. Glazing a little bit more so you darken things down a little bit. Top of this leaf is a bit darker. Darken that down a little bit. Again. Maybe a little bit darker just in here. Switch to my mechanical pencil here, just so I've got a bit more control of that little tip. What about up here? A bit of the mechanical pencil there, just to make that sort of pop out a little bit more. And if you can get yourself one of these mechanical pencils, then you do plan on doing, you know, some more sort of graphite drawings, then yeah, I definitely recommend you get one. Now all I'm doing here is I'm just doing that final sort of evaluation that I like to do. I like to just come in and I like to just darken something down or lighten something up. It's all just about that last sort of little tweaks. I'm just going to grab my pencil eraser. I think this little section here needs to be lighter. Again, every time you sort of lift a bit, get rid of those crumbles. A lot lighter in here. Again, only you can sort of judge what needs to be sort of adjusted in your drawing, because you may not have done it, you know, exactly as I have. It does come down to the paper you use as well. Like this, I do really, really like this Bristol smooth paper. It is one of my favourites, but it's not pure white. It's got a slightly off-white colour. So we've just got to be aware that you're not going to get a really bright sort of white, because the paper's not white and you're limited by the colour of your paper. Again, just little adjustments. I might just try and soften those leaves just a little bit. Again, I might just come in with my Q-tip. Get that just a little pressed down. Like I said, you can spend as much time as you want just making your little adjustments. Like I do want to just sort of darken down just on top of that little vein. And I've lost my little vein there a little bit. I might just need to grab my eraser and just, again, just reinforce it. Same here. This is what I mean. Just little tweaks. Just having a look at your drawings and just seeing what you would, you know, what you'd like to adjust until you're happy with it. Just make sure we're happy all down the bottom here. Like I said, You can use some of that pigment that you've got on that Q-tip, and it works wonders for just getting that little subtle changes in those tones. Now, I'm sure that there is, I'll look at this after we're finished and I'll think, oh, I should have done that. But, you know, for just an afternoon project, what's that taking us all up? From start to finish, you know, we're looking at, you know, just over 2.5 hours. And we've created, you know, quite a beautiful, realistic drawing of a rose. So again, just a little, you know, a little reminder that we do not have to be spending 40 hours or loads and loads of money to just take some time out for ourselves and enjoy that sort of creative process. Because I think we all need it. We definitely need to just, you know, chill out, spend some time just for ourselves. And create something quite beautiful. All I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give it a little signature. I need to find my HB. I'm just going to pop it down, just down here. Alright guys, I hope you've enjoyed drawing along with me for this one. Like I said, spend as much time as you want just making any adjustments and any little tweaks that you think that you need. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.